said, so I'm here to talk about my second book, Defending the Arteries of Rebellion, Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley, 1861 to 1865. It's a really long title, and it's like that for a couple of reasons. First is because the publisher likes it when we have long titles, because then more keywords show up on the internet searches. The second one is to make it really specific, because for the most part, people think Civil War, Mississippi River, they think Vicksburg, they think Port Hudson, and then they think that's it. And if you remember, Vicksburg and Port Hudson both surrendered a week apart in the middle of 1863, so people mostly think of that. And so I wanted to highlight in the book how it's a much bigger, broader campaign. And so it's not just the Mississippi River, it's the entire river valley, and it's not just a few months of the war or a year of the war. There were naval operations for the entire course of the war in its entirety, and so it's worth mentioning and bringing up. So that's one reason that I highlight things like that. So, that being said, here's the Mississippi River. That's what most people think about when they think of the Civil War and its naval operations inland. There's much more to it than that, though. The Mississippi River Valley is what we're looking at, which is the Mississippi River, plus all these other ones. We've got the Tennessee River, the Cumberland River, that's where Ulysses Grant started off with the Battle of Shiloh and so on. We've got the Arkansas and White Rivers in central Arkansas. The Yazoo River system played a significant part in the Vicksburg campaigns. The Red River, of course, in Louisiana. The Chatelain River, Bayou Teche, Bayou Rouge, all in southern Louisiana as well, along with some operations on the coastline, the Mississippi Sound, Lake Pontchartrain area. So it's significantly more than just the Mississippi River itself. There's a lot more to it there, and the goal tonight is to highlight the scope of all this for you so that you can see just what we're looking at overall. Now, that being said, let's look at what the Confederate Navy is going to try to do in the Mississippi River Valley as a whole. And to highlight that, what I want to show you is what the Confederate Navy intended to do, and then we'll see what they were able to carry out with those intentions and ambitions. So to begin with, the Confederacy, when it formed, and then during the second wave of secession after the Battle of Fort Sumter in April 1861, the Confederacy as a whole had the following shipyards where they could build or repair vessels, both civilian ships and warships. The most famous of these would be the Gosport Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia. There's also a U.S. Navy Yard in Pensacola, Florida, that the Confederacy is not going to utilize very much. And then there are a few other places as well that you can see here in Savannah and in Mobile. And take notice, the Mississippi River Valley has 7 shipyards. So of the Confederacy's shipyards overall, a majority of them are in the Mississippi River and its tributary and distributary systems. We've got some in New Orleans, we've got some in Nashville and Memphis, and a couple of others in Louisiana as well. And what we're going to see is that the Confederacy is going to use these shipyards that they have to forge the starting point of their navy, predominantly by building ironclad warships. And what we can see is that based off of the shipyards and where they're located, that's where they're going to build these ironclad warships. So let's look at the breakdown of what ironclad warships are going to start construction in the first year of the Civil War. During this first year of the war, the Confederacy is going to try and build 13 ironclad warships. And that's between April 1861, when the war begins, and March 1862, in a 12-month rotation. And what we're going to see is that the Confederacy is going to try and build 2 ironclads in Virginia, the most famous being the ironclad Virginia. And then there's also the smaller CSS Richmond, which is going to be started in the Norfolk Navy Yard and then finished in Richmond, Virginia as well. They're going to start building 2 ironclads in Charleston, South Carolina. Those are going to be what become the Lady gunboats. They do that because they were raised, the funding was raised through subscriptions by women in Charleston who basically volunteered their own money to start building these from scratch. Notice the Mississippi River Valley has 9 on the list. Now, most people think the Confederacy only had like one ironclad, the Virginia, and then maybe some other stuff. Y'all might be familiar with the CSS Arkansas, and so on. 9. The Confederacy tried to build 9 ironclads on the Mississippi River Valley in the first year of the war. 2 were going to start in New Orleans from the ground up. A third is going to get converted from a tugboat in New Orleans. 2 were going to get started from the ground up in Memphis. Another is going to get started near Nashville. And then they're going to start a whole second wave of ironclads, 3 more in the New Orleans area, 2 on the Mississippi River, and a third in the Lake Pontchartrain area. Now, not all these get built. This is what they start. This is what their ambitions are. And what we're going to see is that those ambitions are going to fall short materially when the fighting starts. So we've got kind of an outline here, some brushstrokes of what the Confederacy's intentions are. Now, how are they going to build them? And it's important to understand that the Confederacy lacks manpower and resources as compared to the United States overall. And so the Confederacy is going to rely on augmenting their limited infrastructure and resources with enslaved labor. And they're going to use African American slaves to augment their naval forces when possible. And that's going to happen in multiple different avenues and approaches. The most popularized notion of using enslaved labor is going to be using African American slaves specifically to help construct warships. This happens on an individual basis where individual skilled craftsmen are hired out to a shipyard, such as what these documents show here. These are receipts for individual enslaved persons being hired out to shipyards in the New Orleans area. In the New Orleans area as well, entire teams of slaves were hired by the hundreds and sent to the shipyards to work as a night shift, where basically they would be unskilled labor that would reposition and preposition supplies, arriving materials, and so on, for the next morning when the skilled craftsmen showed up, so that they could then help use that material to continue building the ironclad warships. We've also got enslaved labor systems helping out. It's not just slaves, it's also the systems themselves. So on the Yazoo River, for example, they're going to take all the smaller steam engines that are used to help compress cotton and move things around, and they're going to merge them all into one spot to try and forge machinery themselves using these smaller pieces of infrastructure because larger things were not available at that point in the war in that location. We've also got slaves that are going to build fortifications supporting Confederate naval operations, just like enslaved persons did in the Richmond, Virginia area and pretty much everywhere else in the Confederacy. And the most interesting one for me is that there's actually at least one instance of slaves going on a warship and manning that ship. And that happened on the Arkansas River. Now, they didn't fight any battles. They were not involved militarily. What happened was these slaves were brought onto the ship. Some Confederate sailors were left on the ship to oversee them, and those slaves were used as the manual labor to keep the maintenance going on the vessel, while most of the crew was then sent to Shreveport to man other warships that were under threat because campaigns were going on actively in those areas. And so we see some juggling of manpower issues happening as well. And that's a big deal that needs to kind of be looked at for the most part. Now, let's look at how this all starts. 1861 has a lot of campaigns that occur in the Mississippi River Valley. The first that occurs is privateering. Jefferson Davis issued letters of marque and reprisal to augment the fact that there was no naval force at the beginning of the war and to start the campaign against the United States merchant fleet. The first letters of marque and reprisal issued to a privateer, and then the first privateer that actually went out to sea to capture U.S. merchants occurred in the New Orleans area. And it was basically, they left the Mississippi River's mouth from the Southwest Pass, found a merchant ship that was going past the Southwest Pass at the same time, and then they just towed it upriver and they said, "You're ours now." So privateering begins in the New Orleans area. It's going to occur in many other parts of the Confederacy as well, but it gets its origins there. We also have campaigns at Ship Island, Mississippi. And I know that's not the Mississippi River, that's a little bit off the coast of Mississippi, but it plays a role here because Ship Island, Mississippi is going to be the location where David Farragut launches his campaign to capture the city of New Orleans. This is where the nearest deep water anchorage is for the United States naval forces to use. He also uses the same island to launch his assaults on on Mobile Bay in 1864, so a very strategically located position. The Confederacy recognized this, and in the summer of 1861, while its navy was being built, the sailors were sitting there waiting for the ship to get finished, and they were sent on a joint operation to capture Ship Island. And when I say joint, it's the very first amphibious landing by Confederate military forces, and it's the first joint military operation. It used elements of the Confederate Navy, Confederate Army, and Confederate Marine Corps all together to take this island. And then the U.S. blockade shows up, the Confederacy realizes they don't have ships to support the island, and then they abandon it, and it remains in the United States' hands for the remainder of the war. Further upriver at the same time, we've got General Leonidas Polk moving into Kentucky. That's his big capture of Columbus, Kentucky, which then shifts Kentucky to a more U.S. stance. There were Confederate warships with Leonidas Polk. When he was moving on Columbus, Kentucky, there was a Confederate warship with Confederate naval sailors operating in the river right there next to him. And those Confederate sailors on their ship were covering Columbus, Kentucky until the heavy artillery further south could arrive so that Leonidas Polk could man that position properly. And then Confederate naval forces are going to stay guarding Columbus, Kentucky until the Confederacy abandons it after the fall of Fort Henry and Donelson in 1862. In October of 1861, there's the Battle of the Head of Passes. So the Mississippi River converges into several different channels that exit the river. They all merge into one spot, the Head of Passes, to then proceed upriver to New Orleans and so on under one main river channel. The U.S. Navy entered that one main channel where everything converged. That's where the river pilots pick everybody up. And the Confederate Navy launched a counterattack. This is the very first real challenge of the U.S. blockade by Confederate naval forces. And they take the first ironclad built, the Confederate ironclad Manassas, which is just a tugboat that they cut the top half off and then kind of like laid some iron on top of it and said, okay, here we go. And that was a privateer, by the way, that the Confederate Navy basically rode some guys onto and said, you belong to us now, we'll pay you later maybe. And then they go and challenge the U.S. blockade. This ironclad Manassas rams a U.S. warship. It does not sink it, but it rams it. The U.S. Navy retreats out of the Head of Passes, and the Confederate Navy claims victory. We broke the blockade, but not really, sort of an idea. Because the U.S. Navy simply just then put ships at each pass to the Mississippi River. There's about 5 of them, and they just guard them the hard way instead for a few months. Further upriver, we've got ships helping the Confederate forces out at the Battle of Belmont. So Ulysses Grant attacks at Belmont. Confederate military forces cross the river on Confederate ships from Columbus, Kentucky to Belmont, and when those Confederate reinforcements show up by ship, that's when Ulysses Grant withdraws from the battle. We've got operations in coastal Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and that's from mid-1861 through March of 1862. The Ship Island expedition was the start of that, and then there was a back and forth with a few Confederate warships, and then the U.S. blockaders harassing each other, trying to coax each other into some shoal water, shallow water, so that they could get stuck in the mud, essentially, run it around, and then they would be forced to surrender to each other. But nobody really hears of these battles because the ships would close one another, shoot a couple of artillery pieces, a gun would jam, or some piece of superstructure would get hit by one shell, and then the ships would retreat from each other without really killing anybody, wounding anybody, or causing significant damage. But this back and forth happened for about 6 months on the coastline, which I find pretty fascinating, because most people go, well, did the Confederacy challenge their coastline? Did they try to actually defend it? And this is really the only instance of active defense of a coastline during the war. And then, of course, we've got the construction and conversion efforts where the Confederacy is trying to build a naval force in the Mississippi River Valley itself. So I keep saying Confederate Navy or Confederate naval forces. That's a pretty tricky situation as well. There is a significant number of groups operating vessels on the Mississippi River for the Confederacy. This many, in fact. We've got the Confederate Navy, augmented by the Marine Corps. They're operating warships, of course. The Confederate Revenue Service. That's the equivalent of the United States Revenue Marine, the precursor to the U.S. Coast Guard. Their job is to collect money or imports and so on for tariffs. They have 2 revenue cutters at New Orleans. Coincidentally, they were both U.S. revenue cutters that were seized at the start of the war. The Confederate Army has their own warships, both operating near Ship Island, also further upriver near Columbus. There's this thing called the River Defense Fleet. That's the Confederate Army too, kind of. It's a bunch of civilian contractors contracted to the Army. They don't answer to the Navy, and they make sure that they know they don't answer to the Navy. In fact, they say they only answer to the Confederate Secretary of War. They don't even answer to generals. They do their own thing. They have 14 ships operating on the river. There are privateers owned by private businesses. They're out to make money. So they'll attack ships when it's cost effective, but not when it's not. Louisiana has its own Navy. You guys know that? The Louisiana Navy consisted of 2 ships, 180 men. Of those 180 men, about 90 of them would die within a year. There's also government contracted steamers, transports, civilian ships that are on loan to the Confederate government to carry supplies, move troops around, and so on. And then we've got the civilian blockade runners who are not transporting people. They're going out to transport supplies overseas and come back with weapons and valuables. Now, so many groups. That's an issue. Who answers to who? Who's in charge? There are cases where Confederate Army forces steal cannons from the Navy that are just sitting on a train. There are cases where Confederate sailors desert their warship and then go enlist with the River Defense Fleet because they get paid $2 a month more than them. And so it's not just who's in charge, it's also where are they getting supplies, where are the people coming from, and can they be coordinated properly? And the answer is in some places they work rather well together, and in some places it's a complete failure. So let's talk about ambitions and goals. This is what both sides brought to bear in 1862's naval campaign. We keep talking about they're trying to build naval forces. This is the naval forces built. The Confederacy tried to build a significant naval force. 9 ironclads. They tried to construct and convert 45 wooden steaming vessels, as well as another 5 floating batteries, that's basically a floating fort without engines, or sailing vessels. Of all of those, they built 4 of the 5 sailing vessels and floating batteries. They got 35 of the 45 wooden steam gunboats in operation. Of the 9 ironclads, only 3 would be fully completed. And of those 3, 0 of them would survive 1862. Let's look at the United States and what they're bringing to bear. The Western Gulf Blockading Squadron, 29 mortar vessels. Those are just rafts or sailing vessels that have one big mortar on them. They're used to bombard fortifications. There's also 25 wooden vessels. Upriver, the Western Gunboat Flotilla. They've got several ironclads as well. They've also got mortar vessels as well. And then a handful of timber-clad vessels. Those are the gunboats that are going to support Ulysses Grant at the Battle of Shiloh, for example. Then there's the U.S. Ram Fleet. That's the U.S. equivalent to their River Defense Fleet. Also part of the U.S. Army, not Navy situation. And they've got several rams as well. If you look at the numbers, and if you remove the green numbers for the United States, because mortar vessels are basically just floating forts, they did not engage in ship-to-ship operations. They were there, they were towed in place, anchored, and then bombarded a fort that then shot back at them. If you look at ship-to-ship combatants, vessels shooting at one another, the Confederacy planned to have pretty much the exact same number of warships that the United States Navy brought to bear. They had ambitions for parity between naval forces on the Mississippi River Valley. 10 Union ironclads versus 9 Confederate ironclads on paper strength. Now, of course, that's not what got built. That's what the paper plan was. So they had real ambitions to build a naval force, and it fell short. And we're going to see kind of how it fell short. Let's also not forget about all the different groups operating ships. The Confederate Navy operated the 3 ironclads that were built, 16 of the wooden steamers, as well as a floating battery. The Confederate Revenue Service had 2 sailing vessels. The Confederate Army operated 3 steam warships and 1 sailing vessel. The River Defense Fleet had 14 steam rams. Basically, they were reinforced on the front with some metal so that they could rush in and smash into an enemy ship. And then they had about 1 or 2 cannons each as well. And then Louisiana's Navy had 2 wooden steamers as well. So that's kind of the breakdown of organizations and what they're going to be doing. So let's get to the battle part, right? Got to see how they operate. So in 1862, that's when all the major battles for the river take place as far as the naval element is concerned. This is what I call the year of decision. Vicksburg and Port Hudson don't fall for another year after 1862, but the United States gains control of most of the river in 1862 and defeats the Confederate naval forces pretty completely by then, forcing them to restart from scratch. So let's look at what those campaigns are. On the upper part of the Mississippi River, there's the Fort Henry and Donelson campaigns in February of 1862, where Ulysses Grant and the U.S. Navy capture those, forcing the withdrawal from Columbus, Kentucky to the secondary upriver location at Island Number 10. A campaign is fought at Island Number 10 in March and April of 1862. The Confederate Navy is there, supporting Confederate ground fortifications. Confederate naval forces transport supplies, evacuate soldiers from one location to another, and provide direct gunfire support. They don't stop the U.S. capture of Island Number 10, but they stall it for about 2 weeks. The Confederate naval forces counterattack at the Battle of Plum Point Bend in May 1862. The Confederate River Defense Fleet, about half of it is there, and they ram and sink 2 U.S. ironclads. But that's it. And then both U.S. ironclads are actually going to rejoin the U.S. Navy within a few months after they're refloated by engineers and repaired. So a victory, but not one followed through. And then in June 1862, there's the Battle of Memphis, where most Confederate naval forces on the upper part of the Mississippi River are destroyed. Now notice February, March, April, May, June. This is not the case of they fought a battle and retreated for 6 months. This is continuous combat operations sustained pretty much every day. And that's going to foreshadow a little bit what's going to happen in 1864 and 1865 with the daily campaigning of Ulysses Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and so on, moving into the interior of the Confederacy. Further downriver, we've got the New Orleans campaign, where David Farragut moves past Fort Jackson and St. Philip and seizes the city of New Orleans. The Battle of Fort Jackson and St. Philip in April 1862 is the largest ship-to-ship battle in the Civil War. And there's about 40 ships involved in it. So most people think Civil War naval battle, 2 ships, 3 ships, 4 ships, there's like 40 of them there. Not all of them are very big, not all of them are very effective, not all of them are used well by their crews, but they're all there. And so most historians go, Farragut got past the forts and defeated a couple of ships that existed. There's significantly more there that the Confederate Navy and Army and River Defense Fleet and Louisiana's Navy all used to different degrees of effectiveness. And then both U.S. squadrons tried to meet in the middle and destroy what's left of the Confederate naval forces. We've got U.S. naval forces advancing up the White River. Confederate sailors are going to man land-based fortifications there and almost destroy another U.S. ironclad. Then we've got operations at Vicksburg, where the Confederate ironclad Arkansas, being finished in Yazoo River, comes down and stalls the U.S. military and naval forces from capturing Vicksburg until the river level of the Mississippi River begins to drop. So in the spring, the river level rises with the thaws from winter upriver, and then as we get to the fall, they drop, of course. And when they dropped that fall, Farragut and his naval forces had to retreat or get stuck in the mud. And the CSS Arkansas was able to stall the capture of Vicksburg long enough for that river level to drop. The Confederacy then launches a major counterattack that you're probably quite familiar with. And I'm not talking about Antietam, and I'm not talking about the Kentucky campaign, I'm talking about Baton Rouge, of course. Confederate naval forces, the CSS Arkansas, cooperated with ground forces under John Breckinridge to recapture the capital of Louisiana. They failed, not because Breckinridge's army was ineffective and not because the sailors weren't trying. They failed because the CSS Arkansas broke down about 10 times because of some engineering issues. It also didn't help that their captain was sick and not present on the ship, and their chief engineer was sick and not present on the ship when it was steaming down from Vicksburg to Baton Rouge. And so they didn't have their top expertise in leadership to forge that emergency repairs. And so they're going to blow up the CSS Arkansas as U.S. ships literally approach it because it's stuck on the riverbank and can't move because its engines are dead. But then those Confederate sailors retreat and help set up this little place called Port Hudson, which is going to hold back U.S. naval forces and military forces into the middle of 1863. Confederate sailors are going to help establish the fortifications at Port Hudson. So the Confederate Navy is basically destroyed, except not quite. They make an effort to reconstitute naval forces in late 1862 and early 1863, but not on the Mississippi River. This time they're doing it on the tributary and distributary waters. Two main naval shipyards are set up at Shreveport, Louisiana, and Yazoo City, Mississippi, and they're going to use those to forge new naval forces from scratch, augmented by the survivors of those 1862 campaigns. So, for example, the Red River, Shreveport's Navy Yard, they're going to build one ironclad, the CSS Missouri, the last ironclad to surrender by the Confederacy in June 1865. They're also going to try to build a second one, but that's not going to work because they don't have the supplies to do it. And then they augment that with several wooden ships. On the Chatelain River, there are several wooden steamers, survivors of the New Orleans campaigns, that are going to be posted there, as well as on Bayou Teche, where they are going to try and build another ironclad warship there to maintain control of southern Louisiana. On the Yazoo River, they're going to build 3 ironclad warships from scratch. None of them will get built completely, and we'll see that happen here in a minute. And those are augmented by the survivors of the river defense fleet that are still around, as well as many merchant and civilian steamers that survived the capture of New Orleans. And then on the Arkansas River, there's a couple of wooden warships as well. They're not going to do anything except sit near Little Rock, and their crews are going to get sent elsewhere because Little Rock is deemed naval insignificant. So we're trying to build another naval force on the tributary systems. The question is, will the ships be ready in time for the naval campaigns of 1863 to start? And the answer is no. So let's see what those campaigns look like. For the most part, they're focused on Vicksburg, Mississippi. Several naval and military campaigns are launched by Ulysses Grant and David Dixon in order to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. Most people are familiar with the part where he swings around and captures and besieges the city, but there were many others. Confederate naval forces were present at the Battle of Fort Hinman, Arkansas, not manning ships, but helping to man fortifications. And those Confederate naval forces actually held joint army commissions as well. So they were both lieutenants in the Confederate Navy and colonels in the Confederate Army simultaneously manning those positions. And they, of course, failed and surrendered to U.S. military and naval forces. Then there's also military and naval operations on the Yazoo River and some other parts of Mississippi, such as in Yazoo Pass, Steele's Bayou, and so on. The Confederate naval forces are trying to stall so that those ironclads being built at Yazoo City can be finished. And if one Confederate ironclad can stop all of David Farragut's warships and save Vicksburg for a year, what can 3 do is what everybody's thinking, including the United States Navy. They're worried about those 3 ironclads. They're going to try and destroy them, and they will. They're going to destroy Yazoo City, Mississippi in 1863 while the city of Vicksburg is being besieged. But it doesn't just stop there. Confederate naval forces continue operating on the Yazoo River for some time, even after Vicksburg surrenders. And it's not necessarily warships, it's a lot of transports, civilian ships, with some naval crews augmenting that are bringing supplies to Vicksburg, and then after the city gets cut off, they're bringing supplies to Joseph Johnston's relief army, trying to raise the siege of Vicksburg, and he fails with that. After Vicksburg capitulates, they spend a couple of weeks mopping up and destroying the last of those transports, and the Confederate Navy is essentially dead in the Yazoo River. Other actions happen still. Most people go, Vicksburg, okay, we're done. There's a lot more there. Now it's smaller scale. There's not 40 ships involved. There's a few ships, but they are still there operating. We've got Red River operations, but not in 1864, in 1863. While Ulysses Grant and David Dixon Porter are trying to capture Vicksburg, they're also trying to advance up the Red River as well. Confederate Army forces are going to destroy a couple of U.S. warships. They're going to capture a couple of U.S. warships. They're even going to capture a U.S. ironclad that a couple of days later they have to sink because the U.S. Navy wants its ironclad back. So they come after it. So again, we see some back and forth battling, and that's going to stall U.S. advances up the Red River for another year, essentially. U.S. naval forces from New Orleans are going to help capture Bayou Teche and the Atchafalaya River. They're going to help destroy the Confederate naval forces there and help Nathaniel Banks clear out southern Louisiana, and then conveniently all those forces then move up and attack Port Hudson, Louisiana after that's cleared out. We've got the Arkansas River. In October 1863, U.S. military forces advance towards Little Rock. The Confederate naval forces there sink their ships because they can't stop the U.S. military attacks. And then all the sailors that are left take the artillery with them, and they head to Shreveport to augment the squadron being built there. 1864, the Red River Expedition again. This is the Nathaniel Banks Red River Expedition of 1864 that ended in the big U.S. failure, in part because of falling river levels again, because of some strategically located Confederate dams that diverted water out of the Red River specifically. Also, Richard Taylor had something to do with that with his Confederate ground forces at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill. The Confederate Navy stood ready to challenge the U.S. naval ascent of the Red River. They had obstructions in the river that blocked the path of the U.S. Navy and stalled them. And then beyond those obstructions, there was the Confederate ironclad Missouri, several wooden ships, and then either some submarines or some torpedo boats, depending on who you ask. I'm on the torpedo boat side of that argument myself. They don't engage in ship-to-ship operations with the U.S. Navy on the Red River in 64, but they're there waiting and standing by. The other efforts stopped the U.S. naval forces before. The Yazoo River. Again, the Confederacy recaptures Yazoo City, and the U.S. Navy goes and clears it out again in 1864 so that they don't try and start rebuilding more warships. The White River. Again, this is not Confederate sailors. This is a couple of guys on horseback shooting shotguns at a ship, and somehow an engine gets disabled, and they board the ship and capture it. They then blow it up right away. They take the cannons off of it and blow it up. They can't do anything with it. There's a lot of that cavalry stuff going on all of a sudden. The same thing happens on the Tennessee River in late 1864, but instead of a few guys on horses, it's all of Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry corps. They seize several U.S. warships, small ones, but they seize several. They seize several U.S. merchant ships as well on the Tennessee River, and then they attack and destroy the Johnsonville Supply Depot, which is the principal main supply depot for the U.S. Army in Tennessee. Forrest's goal is not to restart a Confederate Navy. He wants to destroy the supplies, and he uses the ship to do it. And his goal is to weaken the U.S. military because John Bell Hood is advancing his army into Tennessee at the same time. Forrest is then going to link up with Hood, and they're going to lose the battles of Franklin and Nashville afterwards and basically destroy the Confederate Army of Tennessee. We've got the Hatchie River. That's another case of a couple of guys boarding a ship, taking out some shotguns, and then capturing it. The guys who do that are going to get executed, by the way, for war crimes by the United States government. They're just going to get hung after they're captured a couple of days later. And then the final surrenders. The only forces left for Confederate Navy to surrender at the end of the war were in Shreveport. It's the ironclad Missouri and about one other warship. And that's it. And they're going to surrender in June 1865, the last Confederate ironclad to surrender. Wow, well, that's the end of the war, right? So let's talk about what was so special about Confederate naval forces in the river valley. Innovation is the key here. They tried whatever they could. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Commerce raiding started in New Orleans. Privateering started in New Orleans. Both privateers and also the first commissioned commerce raider, the CSS Sumter, which was captained by then Commander Raphael Semmes, the guy who would then go on to command the CSS Alabama before then commanding the Confederate James River Squadron, and then a brigade of naval soldiers and sailors at Sailor's Creek in 1865 in Virginia. The first for amphibious operations at Ship Island, the first for joint operations both at Ship Island and then further upriver as well at New Madrid, Missouri, Columbus, Kentucky, and so on. The first ironclad warship, the CSS Manassas. The first use of ramming tactics in the Civil War by the CSS Manassas, and then they capitalized on that and built a bunch of other ram fleets, the River Defense Fleet, which then the U.S. Navy copies. A bunch of other Confederate warships are going to build rams as well, most famously the CSS Virginia, which rams a couple of warships at the Battle of Hampton Roads in 1862. The first submarine in the Civil War, New Orleans. They built it there, they tested it a couple of times, then Farragut captured the city, they sunk it in Lake Pontchartrain. Then they moved to Mobile, did the same thing, and then they moved to Charleston and would build the H.L. Hunley, the first submarine to sink an enemy warship in combat operations, though they sank themselves about 3 or 4 times as well, including several entire crews of their own ship in the process. And then, of course, torpedoes, what we would call underwater mines today. Rudimentary at the time, a wooden cask, a wooden barrel, sealed, filled with gunpowder, and then either some sort of contact detonation, or literally just out of the cartoon, there would be a guy with a wire hiding in the woods that would then push the TNT box down to blow it up, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Torpedoes are the most effective weapon the Confederate Navy has. They're going to sink 40 enemy ships using torpedoes during the war, including about 10 U.S. ironclads. 2 of those ironclads are sunk in the Mississippi River Valley on the Yazoo River. The first is the USS Cairo, which is the first U.S. warship sunk by a torpedo in the war, and the warship that was famously raised by Ed Beers in the video that you guys saw at the very beginning. There was another ironclad sunk pretty much in the same spot several months later, the USS Baron de Kalb, which was a City-class ironclad warship as well, a sister ship to the Cairo. And several other ships are going to be suffering damage from torpedoes. The Confederacy didn't just use torpedoes in Yazoo River. They also did at Columbus, Kentucky. At Port Hudson, there were cases where the U.S. Navy could hear the torpedoes bouncing off their hulls, but they didn't go off because they rolled, similarly to what happened at Mobile Bay in 1864 with Farragut and his "damn the torpedoes" speech. So there's a lot of innovation happening for the Confederacy on the Mississippi River Valley. So the Confederacy is able to win some battles, right? But they can't ever seem to capitalize on those victories. And so I just want to highlight really quickly that. So to start off with, they could seize Ship Island, but then they get rid of it 3 months later because they can't support it. They can secure Columbus, Kentucky, a very important strategic position, turns Kentucky away from the Confederacy. They can push back the blockading fleet at the head of the passes in 1861. The blockade remains in effect, and it doesn't change the scope of anything. They can help support New Madrid, Missouri, and Island Number 10, stalls the loss of that position by about 2 weeks. They can sink some U.S. warships at the Battle of Plum Point End, warships that then rejoin the U.S. Navy 2 months later, after the U.S. military seizes the water space that they were sunk in, and then refloats them with their more effective engineers and supply. CSS Arkansas saves Vicksburg for a year. And then its engines break down and it can't capitalize on that, and then they counterattack at Baton Rouge. The Confederacy can defend Bayou Teche. They do so successfully for about 4 months, but then they lose all the ships in that area. They do successfully defend the Red River in 1863, sinking several U.S. ships, capturing several U.S. ships, and stalling campaigns there for a year. Torpedo operations are effective in sinking individual ships, but that doesn't alter the course of the conflict, and it doesn't stop the U.S. Navy from patrolling. It does not take away U.S. naval supremacy. It merely just inconveniences the U.S. Navy and forces them to watch out. The Red River Campaign of 64, they do successfully defend the river, but they don't capitalize on it by destroying the U.S. naval squadron attacking them. And they had a chance to do that because of falling water levels and almost trapping the U.S. Navy for a time. Nathan Bedford Forrest can capture an entire supply depot. That doesn't help recapture Tennessee for the Confederacy. And then all those random guys on horses capturing ships looks good in the newspapers, but it does nothing in the grand scheme of anything. So the Confederacy can win some battles on the Mississippi River Valley. Their ships can win sometimes, but they can't seem to capitalize on those victories to bring about strategic or political gains in the long term. Why? Organizational structure. I mean, there's all the flags again. That many different groups had ships. Who talked to who listened to who got supplies from who. They could not coordinate that effectively when they had the ships in larger numbers where it would have made a better difference for their cause to make that happen. Instead, they failed to coordinate properly, and it cost them the use of the larger numbers of vessels that they had earlier in the war. Same issue, supply management. Supplies are coming from who? Manpower is coming from where? People are deserting one place to go somewhere else, and so on. That compounds that issue. Failure to capitalize on tactical successes, which the previous slide I just showed you. They could win some battles, but they could not expand on that. And then, of course, it's really important to not forget that there's this thing called the U.S. Navy also taking a part here, and that the U.S. Navy was ready faster, and they had more warships, and they had larger warships with more artillery pieces. And so when the Confederacy defended the Mississippi River Valley, the U.S. Navy was able to attack with the initiative at the time of their choosing, and they chose about 2 months before all the Confederate ships were going to be ready. And so they chose to attack at the time advantageous to the U.S. and not the Confederacy, and then the Confederacy spent the rest of the war trying to play catch up, and they could not. So, some final conclusions here. The Confederacy had plans, they had ambitions for naval parity with the United States. They failed to realize those plans, but it's important to understand that they were not just going to take a couple of ships and put some cannons on them and send them out. Like, they had actual plans here for some long-term operations, for some actual construction programs. They just could not capitalize on them to make it happen. Second takeaway, the Mississippi River, a place for naval innovation. The Confederate Navy starts a lot of new tactics because they're getting desperate to try anything, and many of those tactics are copied by other Confederate naval forces and the United States Navy during the course of the war. And then a final thing that I like to mention is the lost cause here is kind of weakened. Not the part about the war was started, about slavery debate, but the other part of the lost cause that people talk about, the fact that the Confederacy had no material chance to win this war. People like to say things like Robert E. Lee had 3 shoes and 8 guys at the end of the war. Obviously, the Confederacy had real plans and real capabilities to build a naval force. They just could not capitalize on that, and they could not follow through on that. And the U.S. Navy attacked them before they were ready to materially bring about that defense. And so, saying the Confederacy had no chance at all here on the Mississippi River Valley, not quite fully accurate, I would say. That being said, we'll go ahead and stop it there. I'm here to answer questions all night. I'm not going to leave till everybody else does. If you'd like more information, you can check out the Emerging Civil War website that I write for. Also, my own personal website, which has copies of all the articles and things that I've written as well, linked there. I have both copies of my book here that you can purchase if you'd like. Though Fought Like Devils one, there's only a couple of those left though, so if you want that one, better show up first, I guess. And if you can't get your hands on the Defending the Arteries of Rebellion book, you can always order it online from my awesome publisher, Savage Baby. So with that being said, I'll stop it there, and we'll open the floor to the best part of the night, when you guys get to tear my argument apart and ask me questions.